and I can welcome everyone to this week's Wednesday webinar. I'm Shannon Dill with University of Maryland Extension. We host these the second and fourth Wednesday of each month at noontime, so hopefully you have lunch with you and you can listen to Megan Todd talking about navigating regulations for value-added foods. So this is part of the Women in Ag program. We like to thank our collaborators of this. There's a number of institutions and partners that we work with. We also have a number of sponsors. So a big thank you to them. And with that, I'm going to turn today's session over to the Agricultural Law Education Initiative, Megan Todd.
Thank you, Shannon. Yes, so my name is Megan Todd. I see some familiar faces in the audience. It's happy to see you all. For anyone who has never seen me present, my name is Megan, and I'm Legal Research Associate at the Agricultural Law Education Initiative. And today's topic, we're going over navigating regulations for value-added foods today. Just housekeeping, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to enter those into the chat at any point during my presentation. And I'll make sure to pause toward the end to go through those questions. And if Shannon could help me read the chat box, I might not be able to see the chat box depending on how my presentation is going. But I've got a lot of slides today as usual, and there's a good chance I might not get through all of them. But like Shannon said, I will share the slide deck with you all so that you can review them and give me questions after the fact if you have them. As she mentioned, I work for the Ag Law Education Initiative. We are an organization. We have attorneys from 3 University of Maryland campuses. I work at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and our goal is to create free resources covering legal topics that agricultural service providers and producers in the state would hopefully find useful in helping them navigate the legal requirements of running their businesses and helping farmers. If you haven't checked us out already, I highly encourage you to go to umaglaw.org, see what we have in our publications library. If by chance you don't find what you're looking for, if you have a topic or question that we haven't addressed, please feel free to reach out to us, because that's what we're here for. And if we don't have something, we'd love to make it something that we can help you and create a resource that you can use. Today's discussion is, of course, meant to be educational only. We have our disclaimer here. It's not intended to be legal advice, even if it sounds really close to what you are questioning or experiencing in your own business. ALEI, we're educators. We're not legal representatives. We are attorneys, but we're not representing you. So we always advise that if your individual service or your business, that you seek the services of an attorney in the state that your business is located in. Okay, so value-added production in Maryland is, I feel like in my realm, it sort of seems like a hot topic right now. And just to give you a little context of what the landscape of value-added production in Maryland looks like. As of 2017, which was the first year that the USDA, or the United States Department of Agricultural Census, actually attempted to measure the value of processed or value-added agricultural products. So that was the first year, the baseline year for Maryland. They recorded over $45 million worth of value-added products being created in the state from only about 506 farms. So it's a handful, creating a lot of valuable goods, food production in the state. And while not, oftentimes they're directly marketed, you have different options for your sales venues, but I think a lot of the demand, or the reason that value-added production can be helpful is because you're direct marketing your resource, your produce, and it's a way to kind of stretch the value, especially if you have an excess inventory. In Maryland, the farmers saw a really sharp increase in direct marketing sales, the demand from the years of 2012 to 2017, according to the 2017 census. I suspect we're going to see that it was also increased when we get the latest census results as well, just because of everything that's been going on. But we can see that value-added production in the state is something that we're going to have increased amount of interest in. So through ALEI, we have been working on, creating some more resources around direct marketing and recently value-added production, and helping to understand the laws that are involved when you are interested in producing value-added goods. So kind of with that background, that context, a year ago or so, ALEI, we submitted a grant proposal and got funding through a specialty crop block grant from the Maryland Department of Agriculture to create a resource or some resources to help growers who are interested in creating value-added products understand the regulatory requirements. We've been doing a lot of work. We created a few years ago a legal guide to direct farm marketing that was really sort of like an overview, a survey of all the different legal laws and regulations a farming business owner direct marketing to consumers would keep in mind, and processing is like a smaller subset of that bigger guide. And so we decided to, take a deeper dive into this particular topic, trying to create some decision trees to help people really hone in on what specific regulations that they need to be worried, focusing on, and what are their requirements for their operation based on the type of product that they're making. So our goal, and this year has been quite the whopper. So we're behind schedule. Unfortunately, I'd wanted to present to you today copies of the PDF decision trees, and maybe do a walkthrough of the Qualtrics, the online decision tree tool that we're developing. But then we're not quite there yet. We're still waiting for some review and formatting, cleanup, things like that. But I definitely expect to be able to launch these resources in November of this year. So if this is something that you're interested in receiving, please reach out to me, or we'll be, shooting out emails and notifications once we get it launched. But you'll see like a little screenshot here on the slide of what our online survey tool might look like if you're doing it on your phone, for instance. It'll be Qualtrics based, so very easy to use and navigate. And at the end of the online tool, you would get a report that lists all of your answers with some details on, what, based on your answers, you should be looking into further when you do your application. The project would also include some resources to help you understand the schedule process review, and also offering technical assistance if you need it. Part of the project is also that's mostly driven through our partner, Melinda Schwartz at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And we have a small food lab pilot through a UMES as part of the project. Once we get it rolled out in November, we'll also be rolling out a small sign-up sheet with instructions on how you could send in a food sample if you have one and you need preliminary testing for either water activity or pH, which I'll talk a little bit more later about as a preliminary step before you submit a processing license application. So that's an overview of the project that's really kind of prompted our ALEI's deeper dive into value-added regulatory requirements. And so the past year, we've been doing a lot of research on it. And yeah, we're excited to get it out to you once it's ready. So when I talk about the regulatory decision trees, and like I mentioned with the legal directory, there's a lot of laws, potential laws and regulations that can apply to any business and farm businesses in particular. But what I'm going to talk about today is really what are those laws or regulations that pop up once you decide that you want to start making a value-added product. And so it's a lot smaller scope of regulations that include the Food Safety Modernization Act, Produce Safety Rule in some contexts. The majority of it, though, what I'm mostly going to be talking about today is the processing license requirements. So Produce Safety Rule is administered and overseen by the Food and Drug Administration, which is a federal agency, but enforced on the state level through the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Processing licenses, however, those regulations are set by the Maryland Department of Health, and oftentimes you would be dealing with your local Department of Health, actually, that administers those state programs, the regulations. And then for the processing, you also have an extra layer that you have to question yourself about and look into to see if it applies to you. And that's the federal Food Safety Modernization Act, again, the federal preventive controls rule for human foods. I'll take a step back. So the Food Safety Modernization Act is a really overarching food safety law that was passed a few years ago, and it includes seven I think it's 7 or 8 rules. And so one of them is for produce production, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And the other one, there's others for processing activities. So once you kind of like take your step into processing activities, you're entering into a new FSMA rule realm. And depending on if you're making human foods, or there's another one for animal food. So if you're doing pet food, for instance, you would be going to the preventive control rule for animal food, not for human food, but we're talking about human food today. And then after you've got your processing and your food safety, thinking about your product labeling requirements and how are you going to label your product. And from a nutritional standpoint or a food safety standpoint on this, it's really thinking about what's the information that you as a business owner need to include on your label, that the government at multiple levels has decided that consumers need in order to make informed decisions about their health and safety. So what nutritional information possibly do you need to put on there, alerting people to allergens, things like that. So, and for labeling, you have to look at regulations established by the Maryland Department of Health, possibly the Maryland Department of Agriculture, often adopting the federal Food and Drug Administration regulations. And then sometimes you have the U.S. Department of Agriculture for organic products come in there too. So you'll see like throughout the process of value-added production, as you're reviewing your regulatory requirements and going through your applications, you're going to be dealing with a lot of different agencies across governments. So it might be kind of confusing to keep everything straight. And that's another reason that we really thought that these decision trees could be helpful in helping you sift through all the materials that are available to you. Another thing I want to just mention, and it's not part of the guide, and I'm not going to go into it in here, but once you get into value-added production, you may also, you should also be making sure you have a conversation with your insurance provider to let them know you're kind of creating this new branch in your business and seeing if product liability insurance would make sense for your business. That's just something that you could do to help manage your risks that could arise from creating a value-added product. Okay, so I'm going to start quickly with food safety and then dive into processing license information. I have some slides about labeling, but we'll see if time permits for me to go into those slides. I'll pause after processing to see how are we on time and to answer some questions. So for the produce safety rule, when we're talking about value-added products, it might not seem like it makes sense all the time, but from the produce safety rule, it basically applies, and I'm simplifying it very much here because there are already a ton of resources on the produce safety rule, but in a really small nutshell, it applies to farm operations that are growing covered crops and are within a certain financial threshold. And covered crops are those defined as those that are typically consumed raw and then do not go through a further kill step to kill any microorganisms or basically processing the crop. And so this might apply to a value-added production or product in a few different ways I'll talk about next. But just keep in mind like that if that's something that you think you're doing, or you're not sure if your crop is covered, there is a list available where you can see what products are not covered by the produce safety rule explicitly. And if it is not on that list, then it is covered. And then you have to go and check to see what your annual sales, food sales amount to, and if they fall within the threshold of, there's a lower threshold that if you're below, I think it's about $26,000 now, it's adjusted every year for inflation, but if you're below that amount, you're exempt from the produce safety rule requirements. If you're in the middle, There's a higher level, it's over $500,000 that you absolutely have to comply. And if you're in the middle, you're qualified exempt and you've got some modified requirements. So that's the produce safety rule. It's enforced within Maryland by the Maryland Department of Agriculture. The requirements are basically to attend a grower training. And if that's something that you need to do or even interested in, which just covers a lot of just produce safety best practices during the growing and harvesting of your crop. We have 3 planned this year. We have opened up registration for the first session, which will take place both remotely and with an option to attend in person in Princess Anne, Maryland, December 7th and December 8th, 2 half-day sessions. You can sign up online if you're interested in that. But back to the value-added product part, produce safety rule. So if your product is the result of only growing, harvesting, packing, or holding produce products on your own farm, that's a question you should ask yourself. If you're only doing that, okay, well then why would you care about, like the processing side of things? Well, if you're doing something on your farm that's like you're growing a fresh fruit and then you're chopping it up and you're putting it into a package for people to eat, that's processing. You're growing it and then you're processing it into something that can be edible, and it's not in its whole unadulterated state, basically. Similarly, if you're doing a dried or dehydrated product from a product that you're growing, like mint leaves or something like that, then you may also be subject to the produce safety rule that would cover your product even as you're processing it. It can be a little complicated when we talk about these types of products, and that's a prime example of why these decision trees are going to be really helpful to help people understand what type of processing license they need from the state, but also how does the federal government categorize their operation if they're both growing and processing on their business. So I will note that let's see, for cut fruits and vegetables, that's an instance where you'll always need a processing license from the state. And then depending on what type of fruit you're processing and a few other things your federal requirements are going to vary. So I won't get too much more into those different products today, but they are covered in our decision trees. So if that's something you're making, we have some resources to help you coming down the pipeline. So during the creation of the decision trees, we first started out by figuring out like what are the end results. And in Maryland, we have 4 basic types of licensing scenarios. So if you are making a value-added product, you're going to fall into one of these categories. Either you're going to be considered a cottage food business where no license is required. You may be considered an on-farm home processing operation and need that license. You may need a retail food service facility license, which is also very common. And then another option is some of the things that that's involved in the processing license application process. But these are the 4 outcomes. So if you go through our decision trees, you're going to end up on one of these types of license, or, one of these types of categories that you would fall into based on a number of factors. And so we were putting the questions together. I got to admit, I came into this project and I was like, okay, this shouldn't be too hard. There's only 4 options to choose from. So how complicated can it be? And I will tell you, it's very complicated. And it's probably part of the reason that we're behind schedule, is because it can be really convoluted. So one of the first questions that you're going to have to ask and then answer for yourself as you approach this resource, or even just, if you're trying to work through the Maryland Department of Health or any program itself, what type of product are you planning to make? And this is an example of there are a certain number, we broke it down into, I think, 7 categories of different types of products that seem to make sense for the flow. And so you've got typically jams and jellies, which are a specific category, like they're a subcategory of canned foods, but typically they're not quite as hazardous as maybe a low acid canned food or an acidified canned food. You also have fermented foods, and then you have your baked goods, you have dried and dehydrated foods, and then you've got your fresh cut fruits and vegetables. I think I covered all of the categories there. But yeah, so you have those main categories of food is how we broke it down. And so based on what type of product you want to make, you would enter into the decision tree. And one of the first things that you need to decide is your product considered a potentially hazardous food? Which I'll talk about in the next slide. And that's something that you have to answer. From there, you want to think about, well, where are you making your product? And that's sort of like a facilities-based question. Are you making your product at home? Are you making your product in a home kitchen that's actually on the farm that you own and operate? Or are you using a commercial kitchen, either like as, one of those professional kitchens you can rent space out, or have you like an actual commercial kitchen in your business? Because that will determine, what you have, what type of facility you currently have, will determine what types of products you can make. But if you want to branch out into different products or expand, you may have to, think about it from a business planning perspective of like, what steps do you need to take to get to the next level of facility standards. The next question is, where do you sell your products, or where do you want to sell your products? So, so basically, this is something, do you want to sell only at a farmer's market, or only at your own farm store or farm stall or stand? Are you selling to other small retail stores, but they're all within Maryland? Or do you live like close to the border, and so selling to your products at farmers markets in Delaware or Pennsylvania come up pretty frequently, and that's an option that you want to have to yourself, or alternatively, are you not really into direct sales and you just want to do majority of wholesale to a grocery store that's local to you or something like that? So thinking about where you want to sell your products will also set the standard for what type of license that you may need or want to pursue. And then the fourth question is, what is your average annual food sales amount? And this can be a little tricky if you're starting out. But basically, it's important to keep in mind that keeping track of like what your annual food sales amounts is good business practice, but also there are a few numbers that you'll see in the few slides that you'll have to like really keep in mind, because those are some thresholds that if you cross over a certain amount, you now need to go to the next level of food processing license. So these are the 4 questions. I think I made it sound pretty simple right now, but there's a lot to unpack for each one. I'll try to get into a little bit for each of these questions today, and be happy to answer questions later. So the first question was about the potentially hazardous nature of your food products. And that's really getting into some of the food safety standards that the state establishes and tracks to determine how to regulate each type of food product. And it gets really complicated. And if you've ever had a chance to go through the regulations and COMAR, the Code of Maryland regulations, or even any of the documents on the Maryland Department of Health, you'll see that there are pretty detailed lists about what types of food are not hazardous, which products are hazardous, which times it's like kind of borderline. And then potentially hazardous basically means like, it seems like it's common sense, but like food that requires temperature control because the food is in a form that's capable of supporting growth and harmful microorganisms, or bacteria, mold, viruses, things like that. So basically you think about it like, we as people like to be warm, we like to be hydrated, we like having some food around, and microorganisms are just the same. So if you think about a food that's got like a lot of sugar, a lot of water content, like cheese, like soft cheeses and pies and things like that, and you're keeping them at room temperature where it's nice and toasty, like perfect temperature, like they're going to thrive. So that could be a potentially hazardous food because over a short period of time, there could be a lot of bacteria that can make someone sick. So that's kind of like the gauge. But I'm not a food scientist, but there are plenty of food scientists, including Shauna Henley, who I noticed is on the call, who can give you more details. But the standards for determining the hazardous of a food are set by pH and water activity. There are definitely lots of resources that can help you understand what those mean in more detail, but those are the two standards that MDH really looks at, and the FDA looks at when determining what is the potential hazard associated with the food that you're making. So pH is a measure of the acidity of the product. And when we think about a number that you'll see a lot in the regulations for the state is 4.6. So a product that has a pH of 4.6 or below, generally considered non-potentially hazardous because it doesn't have an environment that's really conducive for the growth of bacteria and mold and things like that. And the other component is water activity, or the amount of available water that's in the product. Because like I said, we like water, we like being hydrated. And so water is an environment that can really easily, bacteria can really easily grow in. So if it's got a lower water content, which has to do, the measurements is like a water vapor pressure measurement, which I don't fully understand, but like I said, a lot of the extension agents and food scientists that you would be working with to help you out do understand it. And it's something you can measure easily with a piece of equipment. You would typically send your food sample off to a food laboratory and they could do it for you. Or like I said, as part of this project, the food pilot, we can do a quick analysis using some equipment that the University of Maryland Eastern Shore has on hand. But as a general rule, if the water activity is below 0.85, it would be considered non-potentially hazardous. MDH and FDA do have lists of foods that typically would fall below like the standards. So they would be considered non-potentially hazardous, and they've got a list of foods that are above. So if you need to look at a list, say, I know exactly what I might want to make, and you can look at those lists and see where it might fall on that activity. I've also linked some resources here for anybody who's interested in getting their own pH meter or, learning more about water activity. Some great resources to read there. The next question was about where you want to make your food. And that's sort of like a facility standard. And so there are a number of things in the application, and this is where the application processes will really get lengthy. The facility standards that we have, the basic facility standard, even for a home kitchen, if you're cottage food businesses and you have no licensing requirement, you at the very least need to make sure you have access to clean drinking quality water. You have an approved sewage disposal system, right? You've got access to trash disposal, your pipes are working, things like that. And you've got a kitchen, you've got a space with access to clean water, ability to refrigerate your products if you need to. Those are the very baseline requirements. If you've got pets in the house or things like that, there's also often requirements that you need to make sure that you are doing your commercial production activities in your kitchen, like it's all been cleaned and sanitized before you start, and you're only doing your commercial activities all together. You're not mixing commercial and home activities at the same time. So that's just sort of like a process that's on the process side, actually, but facility wise, that's all you need. If you're doing on-farm facility, then they'll come and do an inspection and they'll look for a few more things, but basically it's still a home kitchen that you need to make sure you have documented and can show the inspection agent from MDH that you have the capability to wash and rinse and sanitize all the equipment and utensils you're using. If you have employees, or even if it's just yourself, that you have access to a bathroom and hand washing facilities to clean your hands. Any lighting that is in the kitchen is shatterproof, or there's shields like those light bulb shields over, so if anything shatters, it won't fall into your food product. All the floors, walls, and ceilings in your kitchen are easily cleaned and smooth. You've got adequate ventilation so that grease or other vapors and things like that won't cause an accumulation in like crevices in your kitchen. And like I said, you do have to go through an on-site pre-approval inspection before you would be approved for an on-farm home processing license. And then when you go to commercial, like licenses that need a commercial kitchen, those types of facilities would require a lot of, all of the same things, basic, drinking water, sewage disposal system, adequate kitchen, but you need, a commercial kitchen, you need commercial refrigeration facility, something that can really, you can monitor and maintain a safe temperature that you need for your product. All the cooking surfaces and floors are made of non-porous materials that is smooth and can be easily disinfected. Most commonly we see stainless steel tables, things like that. And a lot of times you need, separate sinks, one for cleaning, one for hand washing, and one for food washing and preparation. So you've got more standards with a commercial kitchen. This isn't a complete exhaustive list, but just to give you an overview of like there's different tiers of licenses, which require different tiers of facility requirements. And then when we were talking about the processing, so we did food safety standards, facility standards, and then you've got your process standards. And these are also food safety standards, but sort of like telling, if you need a license, you're telling the Department of Health exactly what you're doing, what you're using, what are the steps you're taking. And it's a lot of paperwork. It's no small feat to go through an application process. And so one of the things that you may be asked for is a scheduled process, which is defined as a process selected by the processor as adequate under the conditions of manufacture for a given product to achieve commercial sterility and or maintaining a food that will not permit the growth of microorganisms having public health significance. And it's quite the mouthful, but basically it's just kind of like giving them a recipe and the method for what you're making. So like, what are your ingredients? Like, how are you receiving them? How are you storing them? How are you processing them? And what is the list of food and the equipment that you need to create your product? That's the scheduled process. Sometimes you may be requested to, depending on the type of license you need, to have a process authority, which is basically a private third-party consultant that has expertise, knowledge of thermal processing requirements if it's a canned good, or they might have expert knowledge on the acidification process if you're making acidified food, and they evaluate the schedule process and can register with FCA or USDA as needed. So those are some of the things you might be asked for process-wise. And then I also have standard operating procedures, and they seem, scheduled process and operating procedures seem really similar, but the operating procedures are more for creating like training materials or guidelines, basically procedures that your operation, that are specific to your operation, right? So you can't just like copy a whole like a SOP from another business and use it for yours. It has to be very specific to what type of equipment you have, what are your facilities, like where are your sinks, things like that. And they describe the activities necessary for you or your employees to complete the tasks. And they may often be used to train the staff members that are responsible for completing those tasks. I said you can't just copy, I'll go back. You can't just copy somebody else's SOPs. That being said, there are some examples available on the Maryland Department of Health website if you are kind of struggling on a place to start. If you need, there are samples that you can start with. Let's see, what else do I want to say? Another thing that's important for SOPs is because they are mostly used by the managers and the employees, it's like training materials. It's important that when you do have them, you develop them in the language. So like mostly English, or if you've got employees that speak other languages more fluently, having maybe SOPs in a language, copies of them in the language that they speak, so they can more easily understand it. And putting them in a style or format that is really easy to understand. So it doesn't necessarily have to be all words and like a checklist. It can be something that has images and pictures to help people understand, pictures of your specific equipment if you need to, right? To help them really understand how you do it on your operation. And then a final thing that some processing license applications require, I'll talk about it quickly, but I'm not sure that if you're using the decision trees, this might not apply to you. But there's another thing called a hazard analysis critical control point plan. And this is something that, the Maryland Department of Health has adopted. It's also a federal requirement. But basically, requires that you identify those points in your production process that have like higher risks of contamination. And so you take steps that control, which control and can be applied to eliminate or prevent those food safety hazards that you've identified. And reduce it to you can't eliminate it completely, but you can reduce it to an acceptable level. Whether or not you need one of these plans is decided by a priority ranking system when you do your application, and that priority rating is based on the type of product you're making and how the food is prepared. So typically, if you're cooking something, if you're heating something up, that increases your priority rating. So a HACCP plan is required if your food is considered a high or moderate priority rating, but lower priority facilities don't need to submit one necessarily for the state processing license. And lower priority facilities are those that serve commercially packaged, potentially hazardous foods directly to the consumer. They may also serve non-potentially hazardous foods that are cut, assembled, or packaged on the facility, the premises, and then sold in a packaged form. So like candy, popcorn, or other baked goods. And hand-dipped ice cream is also included as a low priority category. Okay, so I've gone through some of the standards that you may see when you're investigating or doing research into the different types of processing licenses that are available in the states, or scenarios that are available in the state. So now I'll go through each of the 4 answers and give a little bit more detail about when they may apply. So for cottage food business, this is the instance when there is no license that you actually need to apply for. That's not to say that you won't have any contact with the Maryland Department of Health at all, or your local Department of Health. You'd still potentially need to reach out to them for a number of reasons, but you don't have to go through the whole processing license application that would require site approval and floor plans and SOPs and things like that. If you are selling to a retail establishment as a cottage food business, well, let me back up a step. So if you're doing a cottage food sales, your options are that you can create and sell non-potentially hazardous foods for sale within the state. So you can sell them directly to consumers at farmers markets, bake sales at your own farm stand. You can do online sales if they're only in state. You can sell at retail establishments too, or, smaller groceries and convenience stores, but only within the state of Maryland. If you do want to sell to a retail, sell through a retail establishment, that would require you to go through a basic food safety course that's, within the past 3 years. So, basically plan on going through a food safety course that's approved every 3 years if you want to maintain a retail business. You are eligible potentially for cottage food business designation as long as you have annual food sales less than $50,000. And this is new. This is as of October 1st of this year. The limit has increased. Before it was $25,000 and now it's up to $50,000. So, a lot more leeway for these smaller businesses before they have to start going through the more complicated process. And that makes sense because if you think about, once you get to $50,000 in sales, you're reaching more consumers, possibly wanting to expand already. But the fact that you're reaching more consumers means that there's sort of an increased risk, health risk that the health department needs to then start to monitor. Like I said, you can only sell in store or in state. And only non-potentially hazardous foods are eligible. So those are things, like baked goods, typically, as long as they don't contain potentially hazardous ingredients, like, cream-filled things are not eligible. Pumpkin pies are not eligible. But you can do hot-filled, high acid fruit jam. So remember I said that 4.6 pH, those are really acidic. So 4.6, that's the natural acidity of a particular fruit. And there is a list established of what those fruits typically are. Those are considered low or non-potentially hazardous. Candy, popcorn, snack goods, certain spice mixtures, just a very long list. And you can access everything from the Maryland Department of Health website for cottage food businesses. If you're doing in Maryland, a cottage food business in Maryland, I would say that, I don't say this often, but the MDH has a delightfully detailed set of resources available to you to read and get an idea of, what qualifies and what doesn't, and when you need to take steps to contact MDH or do a food analysis if your product is sort of like borderline, which a lot of like moist breads are, or icings or fillings, things like that. The next tier, so cottage food is sort of like the lowest, like easiest to attain because you don't really need a license. But the next tier is like an on-farm home processing license. It's really important to remember that this is only available as an option to you if you own a farm, if you have a farm business and making your food product as part of your farm business. If you don't have a farm, then you forget what I'm saying right now. It doesn't apply to you. But if you do have a farm, then you can apply for this processing license so long as your annual sales are $50,000 or $40,000 per year. And you're like, wait a second, that's like lower than the cottage foods. What's the difference? Well, the difference is on a on-farm home processing license, you're able to make some potentially hazardous products where you can't do that at all with a cottage food license or designation. So if you did an on-farm, you can make a few products. There are some specifically listed, like I said, very detailed list of what is allowed for on-farm home processing. To get this license, you apply directly to the Maryland Department of Health, and there are a few resources on the website that you can read and get some more details. Like I said, a list of foods that are eligible, ones that are not eligible, what you need to submit with your application. Those documents are fairly detailed, but they don't always go like tell you how to check off that box on their list. And so some of the resources that we're trying to create with our decision tree project will hopefully give you the next step on like how to satisfy what the MDH outlines in their guidance documents there. The next possible option is a retail food service license. So if your sales are for over $40,000, if you're on a on-farm home processing license, or if you're a cottage food business and you go over $50,000, then you would need to apply for a retail food service license. And the benefit is, like, if you go over the sales, those sales limits, and you apply for this license, then you have, you've got opened up more possibilities. You can start selling in any venue. You can sell across state lines. You can sell to other retailers. The only caveat is that you have to maintain wholesale transactions at less than 25% of your total revenue or annual food sales. But you do also need to take a lot more steps in making sure that your facility and your process standards are meeting MDH's standards. So you would need to upgrade to a commercial kitchen, maybe not necessarily installing a kitchen, but you can rent out some space in a commercial kitchen. You would need to undergo a plan review or a process review. You would need to submit a number of documents with your application, like floor plans, create those SOPs that address the manufacturing practices, making your product, how you would train your employees, and then how are you going to do like cleaning and sanitizing in your facility. This facility license is predominantly, you work with your local health department, and it can be a little tricky because each county, overall, they're mostly the same. They're mostly the same requirements. But their applications look different. The application fee may be different based on your location. They may have some additional food safety requirements or, requirements as part of their application. So it's really important. You can go to this link and find your county local Department of Health. And most of them have their application pretty easy to find, but if you can't, you just give them a call and say, I'm interested in doing this. Like, where can I find it? But yeah, from that point on, you work with the local Department of Health to get your license. However, if you are producing a low acid canned food or an acidified food or certain pickled foods, then your application has to go through the Maryland Department of Health, which, they have their own application. Again, the requirements are overall the same, but the fees may be different and the people that you're working with are different. And I say certain pickled foods because it's not really clarified in any of the Department of Health guidance. So that's something that if you're making a pickled food and it's not on the approved on-farm home processing food license, then you would probably reach out and ask, is this something that's covered or not? And then the final licensing option is the food processing plant license. And so if your goal is to do wholesale and you want to do all wholesale or majority wholesale for your product, then you're going to go for this license. Your requirements are overall the same as a retail food facility license. Plus, you also need to have more documents, of course. You need to have an allergen control plan. Basically, how are you going to make sure that you're tracking potential allergens, which are, I think it's a list of 8 or 9, that the FDA officially recognizes as allergens. Those are the things that you have to track. You would have to have a recall plan. What happens if somebody gets sick? How are you going to identify what batch it came from and then initiate a process to get all of those batched items out of the consumer's reach or market stream? Have a sanitation SOP, same, cleaning and sanitizing. And then if you are one of those products that is considered a cooked product, a high or moderate priority facility, then you would need a HACCP plan as well. And these are links to resources that are on the Maryland Department of Health website. I will say, apply directly. For this one, you apply directly with the Maryland Department of Health. I would say, that's a lot of information, and we refer a lot to existing resources, but I think as we did this project and as we did the decision trees, one of the things that I encountered personally was like seeing all the documents, but not exactly at first understanding like which document do I look at for which license. And so that's something that through this process, we're really trying to help you go through and hone in on which resources are most relevant to your operation based on the number of questions, type of product you're making, where you're making it, where you want to sell, and what your average annual sales amounts are. So that's the processing license information. I do have one more slide for licensing and then some federal information, but then I'll take a break because we're just about at time and open it up for some questions. So just for sampling licenses purposes, because I'm sure somebody's thinking about this and, it's separate than a processing license, but say, you have your license and you're at a market and you want to like offer a sample. Yes, you may have to also get another license, which is fun. And these ones, sampling licenses are something that intend to offer, if you intend to offer your samples of your product at the point of sale, like at a farmer's market or a farm stand, then that's something you go through your local health department to acquire. It's important to know that offering a seasonal farmer's market sampling license, which is what it's generally called, it varies by county, but that offering is a discretionary power of the county. So your county could easily have one, but if you can't find that application on the county website, it may be because your county doesn't offer a sampling license. And so if your county does not offer a sampling license, one option would be for your facility to apply for a state temporary food service facility license, which is basically the same thing. I think it's a very short period of time that you are able to offer samples and food at a different location, but you have to go through the state to get it instead of the local health department. Let's see. Two things that's important to keep in mind though is you don't need a sampling license to offer product samples at point of sale if all you're doing is, giving uncut raw agricultural products like grapes or blueberries or something, right? Or if you have a cottage food business, because part of the cottage food business standards is that everything you sell has to be prepackaged. And so if you're going to offer samples, that's okay, as long as you process the sample in your kitchen and then package it. And so when you give the sample, they're already packaged in like little cups with lids or, plastic bags, however you package it, that's fine. And you also need to make sure you have your product label on display so that the consumer can have access to it and review the ingredients if they want to. And making sure that if you, for instance, you are cottage food and you have like a dried good, like a dip mix or something, you can't alter it in a way, prepare it or cook it that would make it into a potentially hazardous food product. So like mixing sour cream in with a dip mix or anything like that, that you would have to refrigerate at some point. Oh boy. I'm gonna go ahead and pause here and see if there's any questions in the chat. Yes, 9 allergens. Thank you, Shauna. And I will say before I get into the questions, there's a lot of information here and a lot of the steps it's a lengthy process. So one of the things that we also advise in the guide and the directory is that you want to do a lot of market research and, business strategies and things like that before you really take a dive into it to see if it's worth something that is worthwhile for your business. But the Food Ventures program that Shauna and Niath head through the University of Maryland Extension is something that I would highly recommend. It's got a lot of detailed information that help you get and understand so much related to value-added production.
So Megan, we do have a couple questions in here if you do want to address those now.
Yeah.
One is that there's a specialty mushroom farm that's inside of a commercial warehouse. It shouldn't matter as far as qualifying as on-farm processing license. So yeah, both of our questions are kind of that definition of farm and on-farm.
Oh, that's fun. That's a great question. Hi, Elizabeth. You always have great questions. Okay, my farm is a special. Include a commercial warehouse. Okay, that shouldn't matter as far as qualifying for on-farm processing license, right? That's a good question. I can't remember if the Maryland Department of Health, I don't think you need to have agriculturally assessed land to qualify as farm, because I was just reading the farm definition in COMAR in the Department of Health regs, and they define farm as, the facility that you're growing the product on. And I did not see a reference to agriculturally assessed property.
That's kind of how I interpreted it too, as long as it's basically the same space where you're growing.
That is my understanding. Oh shoot, I can't pull it up right now. But if you go into, see, and this is another problem, there's like the information is sort of scattered. If you go into the cottage food guideline document that MDH created, so if you go to the cottage food website, there's like a guidelines document. It's right at the top on the right hand column that was recently revised. At the very end of that document, they have two like decision tree type things, and they talk about, there's a lot of some information in there about on-farm production. After this webinar, I'm going to go and look at that and I can email you.
Okay, and then do you mind if I ask another question sort of related? So
yeah.
Our warehouse is the typical like open warehouse style where the ceiling is exposed, is very high. It's like I'd say probably, I don't know, 18-foot ceilings, but it's that like exposed steel style. And then our walls are made of painted, I don't know what the word is, but it's like that cinder block. It's painted cinder block, and our floors are painted concrete. So are those things that we might need to cover in like a stainless steel backing or something like that? for the walls? Like, how does that work as far as those requirements for like, you know, smooth and covered and all of that stuff for the space? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
I want to ask Shauna, can I put you on the spot? Do you know about the facility? I know they have to be easily cleaned and there's the ability to like seal floors and walls. But those 18-foot ceilings, okay. She's saying that there's some current good manufacturing practices guidelines. Let's see. That we could refer to.
Okay, is that something that you'd have a resource where I could find that?
Yeah. I'll email it to you also.
Okay,
Correct.
thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. And Shauna is saying that she and her colleague Rohan would also be able to help you, and her email is in the chat. I can connect you. I'll connect you in a little bit.
Great, thank you so much. I'm also working with, I reached out to Miss Henrietta, who had taught a class on, you know, processing herbs and things like that. So I am getting some information from her, but it's probably going to take a team effort because we're a little bit unusual, I think.
Yeah. Are you doing dried mushrooms?
That's what we're working up to, dried mushrooms and also extracts, you know, like tinctures and things like that. And I know both of those kind of sort of fall into two different categories, I think.
Yeah. Awesome. Those are great questions. Thank you. Yeah, we'll do some work behind the scenes and get you connected.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Anybody else have any questions? So Shannon, I'm going to go ahead and stop my PowerPoint here. But
Okay.
for anybody who is interested in finishing the PowerPoints later on, I'm going to share and you can review. And if you have any questions about the content of any of the slides, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions and send resources and things like that.
So I'm going to stop recording, and if there are questions, feel free to unmute or put those in the chat.